When I left my fears behind, my name is John. I'm an old man now, but I still remember the days when fear ruled my life. I lived in a small town by the sea. The town was quiet, with narrow streets and old houses. The sound of waves was always there, like a song that never ended. When I was young, I was afraid of everything. I feared the dark, the deep water, and even strangers' voices. My hands would shake and my heart would race. My father said, "Fear is normal." But my fear felt like a monster living inside me. One summer, my father took me to the harbor. He was a fisherman, strong and fearless. The sea was wild that day, the waves crashing against the boats. "Today you will learn to sail," he said. My legs felt weak, but I followed him. The boat was small, and the wood creaked under my feet. The wind pulled the sails, and the boat moved quickly. I held the rope tightly, my knuckles white. My father laughed. "Don't fear the sea," he shouted. "It's our friend." But the sky turned dark. Rain fell like stones, and the waves grew taller. The boat rocked violently. I screamed, "We will drown!" My father grabbed my shoulders. "Look at the horizon," he said. "Focus on the light, not the storm." I looked at the distant light of the lighthouse. My father's voice was calm. "Breathe," he said. I breathed slowly, my eyes fixed on the light. The storm raged, but my heart steadied. For the first time, I felt courage. When we returned to shore, my clothes were wet and my body ached. But something inside me had changed. My father smiled. "You faced the storm," he said. That night, I slept without nightmares. Years passed. I became a fisherman like my father. The sea was still powerful, but I learned to respect it, not fear it. I sailed through storms, guided by the lighthouse. Fear stayed with me, but it no longer controlled me. Now, as I sit by the window watching the waves, I smile. The young boy who trembled at shadows is gone. Life taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the choice to move forward. Life after the storm was different. I worked harder on the boat, my hands growing rough like my father's. The sea still frightened me, but I whispered, "Focus on the light," and my heart calmed. My father praised my strength, but I knew fear lingered in the corners of my mind. One cold winter, my father fell ill. His cough echoed through our small house, deep and rattling. The doctor said, "Rest and warmth," but my father's skin burned like fire. I sat by his bed, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. His eyes, once bright, were cloudy. "You must sail alone tomorrow," he said. My throat tightened. The next morning, the sky was gray. I stood on the boat alone, the ropes cold in my hands. The waves slapped the hull, angry and loud. I wanted to run back home, but my father's voice echoed, "Focus on the light." I raised the sails and gripped the wheel. The sea tested me. Wind tore at the sails, and rain blinded my eyes. I thought of my father weak in bed, trusting me to bring back fish. I thought of his lessons, how to read the waves, how to steer through chaos. My fear turned into fire. I shouted at the storm, "You will not break me." When I returned, the boat was full of fish. My father stood at the harbor wrapped in a blanket, smiling. "You did it," he said. But that night his fever worsened. He held my hand and whispered, "Fear will always come, but you know how to fight it." His words became my armor. Weeks later, my father died. The house felt empty, the silence heavy. I sat by the window watching the sea he loved. Grief was a new kind of storm, dark and endless. I wanted to hide, but I heard his voice, focus on the light. The lighthouse beam cut through the night, steady and sure. I kept fishing, rising before dawn. The sea became my teacher. Some days were calm, others wild, but I learned to breathe through the fear. Villagers called me brave, but bravery was a choice, a step forward even when my legs shook. Years passed. I married a kind woman named Clara. She had eyes like the ocean and a laugh that warmed our home. When our son was born, I held him and cried. "Teach him to face storms," Clara said. I promised I would. Now, as I rock my grandson to sleep, I tell him of the sea and the boy who feared it. Fear is not your enemy, I say. It is the teacher who shows you your strength. He listens, his small hand clutching mine. And I hope he learns to dance with life's storms. My son, David, grew quickly. He had his mother's eyes and my restless spirit. At 5, he begged to join me on the boat. Clara worried. "The sea is dangerous," she said, but I remembered my father's words. Fear must not win. I lifted David onto the deck, his small boots slipping on wet wood. The first trip was calm. David laughed as seagulls circled above, their cries mixing with the wind. He held a tiny fishing rod, his hands trembling with excitement. "Will we catch a whale, Papa?" he asked. I smiled. "Only if the sea allows it," I said. But one autumn day the sea showed its anger. Dark clouds gathered as we sailed. David clung to my leg, his face pale. "I'm scared," he whispered. I knelt beside him. "Look at the lighthouse," I said. "The light is always there, even in storms." He nodded, tears mixing with rain. We fought the waves together. My hands bled from pulling ropes, and David's shouts were lost in the wind. Yet, when we reached the harbor, he grinned. "We did it, Papa!" he yelled. Clara hugged us tightly, her own fear melting into pride. Years later, Clara fell ill. Her cough reminded me of my father's, a sound that haunted my sleep. She grew thin, her voice a shadow. "Promise to teach David courage," she said. I held her hand, my throat burning. "I promise," I whispered. The night she died, the sea was eerily still. David cried in my arms, his small body shaking. I stared at the lighthouse, its beams steady. Focus on the light, I told myself. But grief was a wave I couldn't control. I stopped fishing. The boat sat in the harbor, its sails folded like broken wings. David asked, "Will we ever sail again?" I had no answer. Fear had returned, not of storms, but of failing Clara's last wish. One morning, David dragged me to the boat. "We have to go," he insisted. His voice, so like his mother's, left no room for refusal. The sea greeted us with gentle waves. David took the wheel, his hands steady. "Teach me, Papa," he said. I showed him the rhythms of the sea, how to read the wind, how to mend nets. how to laugh when waves soaked his shirt. His courage rekindled mine. We sailed every day, the boat cutting through water like a promise. Now, as I watch David teach his son to sail, I hear Clara's laughter in the wind. The sea took much from me, but it gave back more. Fear and love are twins, I've learned, both carving depth into a life. David became a man of the sea, his hands calloused and his heart steady. He married a woman named Elena, whose laughter reminded me of Clara's. They built a house near the harbor, where the smell of salt hung in the air. Their daughter, Emily, was born with eyes like storm clouds and a voice that silenced rooms. When Emily turned 7, she begged to sail. Elena resisted. "She's too young," she said, but David smiled. "Fear is not inherited," he told her. He lifted Emily onto the boat, her tiny feet dancing on the deck. I watched from the shore, my old bones aching with memory. The sea was calm that day, the sun painting gold on the waves. Emily held the rope, her small face serious. "Like this, Grandpa?" she asked. I nodded, my throat tight. David's voice carried over the water. "Focus on the light." The words had become our family's anthem, but storms come when least expected. One summer afternoon, dark clouds swallowed the sun. Emily clung to the mast, her braids whipping in the wind. "I'm scared, Papa," she cried. David knelt beside her. "Fear is a wave," he said. "Let it pass under you." The boat rocked violently, rain stung our faces, and thunder shook the sky. I gripped the wheel, my hands trembling, not from fear, but age. David shouted orders, his voice cutting through chaos. Emily crouched low, her eyes locked on the lighthouse beam. When the storm faded, Emily stood first. Her dress was soaked, her knees scraped, but she grinned. "We won!" she yelled. David hugged her, pride glowing in his eyes. I looked at the horizon, where gray met blue, and felt Clara's presence in the wind. That night, Emily drew a picture, 3 generations on a boat, a storm raging, and a lighthouse piercing the dark. She taped it to my wall. "This is us," she said. The drawing stayed there for years, fading but never forgotten. Time moved like the tide. My hair turned white, and my steps slowed. I sat on the porch, watching David teach Emily to mend nets. Her hands worked quickly, her tongue sticking out in concentration. "You're a natural," he said. She beamed sunlight in her hair. One evening, pain shot through my chest. I gasped, clutching the chair. David rushed to me. "It's okay, Papa," he whispered, but I knew this storm I could not outrun. Emily held my hand, her tears warm on my skin. "Don't go," she pleaded. I smiled. "Listen to the waves," I said. "They will always remind you of me." My eyes closed, but my heart stayed light. The last thing I heard was Emily's voice. "Focus on the light." After John's death, the sea felt quieter. David stood at the harbor, staring at the boat his father had loved. The wood was weathered, the paint chipped, but it still floated, a stubborn survivor. Emily stood beside him, her small hand in his. "Grandpa is with the waves now," she said. David nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Days passed slowly. Emily returned to school, her laughter softer, her eyes often distant. She drew pictures of John, sailing, laughing, holding her hand. David taped them to the boat's cabin walls. At night he sat on the porch, listening to the waves, imagining his father's voice. Focus on the light. One afternoon, Emily refused to sail. She stood on the dock, her arms crossed. "What if the storm comes?" she asked. David knelt, wiping her tears. "Storms always come," he said, "but so does the light." He pointed to the lighthouse, its beams steady. Emily bit her lip, then stepped onto the boat. The sea was restless that day. Clouds hung low and the wind smelled of rain. Emily gripped the rail, her knuckles white. David handed her the rope. "Hold it like Grandpa taught you," he said. She obeyed, her breath shallow. When the first wave hit, she screamed. David steadied the wheel. "Look ahead, Emily. See the lighthouse?" Her eyes darted to the distant glow. "Breathe," he said. She inhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing. The boat climbed each wave, then slid down like a dance. Emily's fear turned to focus, her small body swaying with the rhythm. By evening, the sky cleared. Emily sat on the deck, her hair tangled, her cheeks pink. "I wasn't scared," she lied. David laughed. "It's okay to be scared," he said. Grandpa was scared, too. She leaned against him, watching the lighthouse blink. "I miss him," she whispered. Weeks later, a storm stronger than any in years approached. The radio buzzed with warnings. Emily stared at the boat. "We have to secure it," David said. Rain lashed their faces as they tied ropes and lowered sails. Waves crashed over the dock, hungry and wild. Suddenly, a rope snapped. The boat lurched, pulling free. David lunged, grabbing the edge. "Papa!" Emily screamed. He slipped, his legs dragging in the water. Emily froze, then ran. She grabbed the rope, her small hands burning, and pulled. David clawed back onto the dock, gasping. The boat broke loose, vanishing into the storm. David hugged Emily, both soaked and shaking. "You saved me," he said. She trembled, her voice fierce. I remembered the light. The next morning, the boat was found miles down the coast, battered but whole. David and Emily stood beside it. "We'll rebuild," he said. Emily touched the broken mast. "Grandpa would be proud," she replied. The lighthouse beam swept over them, a silent promise. Years flowed like the river meeting the sea. Emily grew tall and strong, her storm cloud eyes now sharp with wisdom. She became a fisherwoman, her hands rough and skilled. The boat, rebuilt many times, still bore John's name on its side. David grew old, his hair silver like moonlight, but his voice carried the same strength. One morning, Emily brought her daughter Mara to the harbor. The girl was 5, her curls wild and her laughter loud. "This is your great-grandfather's boat," Emily said. Mara touched the worn wood, her fingers tracing the letters. "Can I sail?" she asked. David, leaning on his cane, smiled. "Today you begin." The sea was calm, the sky a soft blue. Mara sat at the bow, her legs swinging. Emily taught her to hold the rope, her voice gentle. "The sea is powerful," she said, "but so are you." Mara nodded, her small face serious. David watched, his heart full. A storm brewed that afternoon, sudden and fierce. Waves rose like mountains, and the wind screamed. Mara clung to Emily's leg, crying, "I want to go home." Emily knelt, wiping her tears. "Look at the lighthouse," she said. "See the light? It's always there." Mara stared at the beam, her breathing slowing. David took the wheel, his hands steady despite their tremble. "Hold the rope tight, Mara," he shouted. The girl obeyed, her tiny hands gripping until her knuckles widened. The boat climbed each wave, shuddering but unbroken. Emily shouted directions, her voice cutting through the storm. When the sky cleared, Mara stood first. Her dress was soaked, her hair a mess, but she grinned. "We won!" she yelled, echoing Emily's words from long ago. David hugged her, his laughter mixing with tears. "Your great-grandpa would be proud," he whispered. That night, David sat on the porch, the lighthouse beam sweeping over him. His breathing was shallow, his body tired. Emily sat beside him, Mara asleep in her arms. "You taught us well," Emily said. David smiled. "And you will teach her." At dawn, David's chair was empty. His hat rested on the railing, the wind tugging its brim. Emily found a note in his pocket. "The sea always returns what it loves. Do not fear the storms." She held it to her heart, watching the horizon. Mara grew, her courage blooming with each sail. She drew pictures of 4 generations on the boat: John, David, Emily, and herself, under a lighthouse's glow. The drawings filled the house, a rainbow of memory and hope. Now, as an old woman, Emily sits on the same porch. Mara's daughter plays in the sand, her laughter carried by the wind. The boat, patched and proud, rests in the harbor. The lighthouse still stands, its beam eternal. When storms come, the family gathers. They sail into the rain, laughter and shouts blending with thunder. Fear may knock, but courage answers, for they know light persists, love outlives loss, and the sea teaches the same lesson to every generation.